Hi, everyone. This is the Cloak and Dagger weekly briefing with Albert Marco and myself, Tony Nash. Somebody last week called us a bloviating duo of something. I thought that was hilarious. So welcome to
Whatever.
the Bloviating Old Men podcast on J.
Probably some British dude.
Yeah, probably. So it's been we had a show earlier this week, but there's been so much happening. We thought it was necessary to get something to you today as well. So there are several topics we're covering. The first is the Middle East trip. Of course, we're going to talk through the new investment. We're going to talk about what it does to the petrodollar, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it does to Russia's grip on the region. Next, we're going to talk about the big, beautiful bill. This is the budget bill that's going through U.S. Congress right now. And finally, we're going to talk about the ECB and Europe's dependence on dollar swaps. So, Albert,
Oh
tell
yeah.
me about the hat. What's the hat?
Oh, just a watch brand, old school
Okay,
Swiss watch brand.
just an old school Swiss watch.
Nice, and I like light blue. I'm trying to set the tone of calm and peace.
Calm light blue. So thus my shirt, right?
Yeah,
So
there you
trying to
go,
be
blue.
calm today. It's Friday.
We're not
Feeling
representing the Democratic Party or the
right,
GOP.
right,
There's
exactly.
no blue versus red here.
Notice there's both red and blue in my company logo. So we play both sides. So okay, so this Middle East trip, lots and lots of announcements, a lot to take in. I actually don't think anybody's really covered all of it, and we're not going to cover all of it here.
No.
You know, over $1 trillion announced from Saudi, over $1 trillion announced from UAE, over $1 trillion announced from Qatar. Is it all going to come in? Probably not, right? These things always, regardless of who's in power, when these investment announcements are made, it's always an aggressively optimistic announcement, right? Or do you think every dollar is going to come in?
No, I don't think any. I think maybe a third of it at most come in, and even then, it's going to trickle in over the next few years.
Right. I
Things
would
change.
say 60% over probably the next 6 or 7 years, but that's okay. You can see the glass
Yeah, yeah. You're,
half
you're more
empty.
optimistic than I am. Okay.
Right, exactly. So, okay, so some of those investments, of course, there's a little bit of reciprocality there where U.S. companies are building kind of an AI city in Saudi Arabia, which is fine. It's good. They want to transition their economy. The U.S. is helping them do that. I even saw the announcement of a UAE aluminum company building a $4 billion smelter or something. Maybe it's more than $4 billion in Oklahoma, right? So, this is great. It's, these are the types of businesses that the administration wants. It's going to a part of the country that isn't glamorous. It's Oklahoma, right? I love Oklahoma, but it's not, investing in Virginia or California or whatever. And it's great. We get some investment there. When
Oklahoma, right? Where there's oil fields underneath the farms.
exactly. So, when I just did a speech in California last week, and I was explaining to these guys, I live in Texas. People in Texas sweat for a living. We get our hands dirty. Like I hear people say, "Oh, Americans won't do those manufacturing jobs." I have a ton of friends who would be happy to do those jobs, right? Work in a
Mhm.
smelting plant, work in a assembly plant, all that stuff, right? And so there is no shortage of people who would rather do that than work at, some fast food place or whatever,
Of
right?
course.
So, that for the cynics who claim that Americans don't want to do manufacturing jobs, it's not true.
Well,
Uh,
those cynics look at like East Coast elite and whatnot, and
yeah,
these urban cities that Gen Z social media influencers are not really like middle America where and rural America where most of the economy operates out of.
right. They've got a master's in some social science, like
Yeah, yeah.
economics or whatever, right? And
Great.
so, yeah. So what we need is a world ruled by economists, I think. So that's complete sarcasm for people who
I
don't.
know.
Okay, so we've got a lot of investment coming in. It's big numbers. We expect a portion of it to be reality. We expect it to be, happen over a number of years, not like 2 months. Because, I can see in 8 weeks, people are going to say, well, they said there's $3 trillion coming in. Where is it? It's like, okay, well, you have to realize one of the things I wanted to point out, we may have talked about this before. The Qataris announced that they want to put $1 trillion of investment into the U.S. into a fund. So, and you know this, Albert, I just want to explain this. If you take $1 trillion of cash offshore and put it into the US, you're not just doing a bank transfer, okay? You have to go to the Fed. You have to ask for the Fed's permission to bring that amount of money in. I mean, I don't care if it's $2 billion. You have to ask the Fed and let the Fed know that you're bringing that money in. They have to approve it. And they have to approve over what period that can come in. Because if you add that much supply to domestic US dollars, that can change the economy. And it can change let's say they put a 10% allocation to public equities for that $1 trillion of Qatari funds. You add $100 billion into US equity markets overnight, that's going to rally everything, which seemingly would make everyone happy, but that's market moving money, right? So you have to manage the rate at which that money comes into the US. And so it has to be approved by the Fed. It has to be approved by Commerce. It has to be approved by probably DOD. There are a number of people who have to approve investments of that magnitude coming into the US. So these announcements, and I don't think this is appreciated, I guess now 10 or 11 trillion dollars of investments that have been secured over the last 4 months under the Trump administration, that forces the Fed to work overtime in terms of when and how to accept that money. There are a lot of people within the banking system that are working on how do we accept that money? What do we do with it? How do we manage it? People looking at the risk associated with bringing that money in. Even a temporary transfer of something that's going to go into, say, an AI factory or whatever, right? That money is temporary. So you have to have people in, say, corporate treasury and in other parts of government aware of that, say, $50 billion, and helping to manage that money because there's risk associated with it. The money doesn't just sit in an account and nothing happens with it. So there are a lot of monetary plumbing logistics that happen when these sorts of things are announced. And so again, it's not just, you just don't throw the money through a wire into an account at, Deutsche Bank or to, some American bank, B of A or whatever. There's a lot of planning that goes into that.
Yeah.
And so they're effectively also, because I know you're an expert on Eurodollars, they're effectively taking money out of the Eurodollar system and putting it into the US system. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. That's exactly what it is. The dollars that were offshore, not in the U.S. banking system, are considered euro dollars, and now they're coming back into the U.S. So those go off, those go off market basically.
Right. And I'd love to think through it. I don't know the implications of shrinking, say, the Eurodollar supply by, a few $1 trillion. Like, what does that do to the offshore US dollar in terms of appreciating the US dollar? Right. So I want to, maybe think a little bit through that, but also, all these big announcements about investment are great. All the bilateral relationships are great, but we also have to think through what this does to the status of the petrodollar, because we've been pilloried and, there's been a constant declaration that the dollar is dead for the last 5 or 10 years, and BRICS currencies and blah, 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 right? So we can go into this for the 107th time. If you think that India and China are going to be allies and have a monetary unit together, I don't know what you're smoking. But the petrodollar, so when you have these countries who are committing US dollar denominated investments in trillions of dollars, whether or not that happens, that puts upward pressure on the value of the Eurodollar. And those countries reinforce their commitment to the dollar for pricing their export commodities, oil and gas and other things, right? So it's interesting to me, Albert, to think through where does that put China in terms of paying for their oil and gas in dollars. So we've had this kind of honeymoon period where people have experimented with the ability to pay for oil and gas in non-dollar currencies. And the whole time, it doesn't matter if they're paying in CNY, the price is still denominated in dollars. And if they're paying in another currency, there's a risk premium put on top of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're venturing off into the whole euro dollar explanation, but
Yep.
first of all, there is no such thing as the petrodollar anymore. That's a relic that people want to use as a term. It
Yep.
really is just a euro dollar at this point in time. But when it comes to settling commodities or anything, no matter what it is, like I've explained multiple times, if Japan and Sweden want to interact with and trade, how do those two currencies get settled? Well, they both get transferred to the New York Fed, where it gets converted from their currency to dollars to the other currency, and then shipped over to the other country for settlement.
Right.
So without dollars, nothing works. Literally
Right.
nothing works.
So what you're telling me is they're not using the Chinese chips system, it's chips, right? Or something like that,
Yeah, 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 chips. Yeah.
uh, to settle between Sweden and whatever country, right?
No, no, absolutely not. I mean, the whole chip system is just a little gimmick that the Chinese did for their own little Ponzi schemes throughout the world. So
Right. It's
it's not,
effectively a barter system.
yeah, effectively, it's effectively a fancy name for a barter system, but it just doesn't have any teeth, doesn't do anything to the dollar whatsoever. In fact, the Chinese are short of dollars, and they're actively, purchasing treasuries and whatnot through proxies.
Yep. So after this trip, anybody who talks to you about a BRICS currency is effectively telling you they don't understand global currency dynamics because
Well, they're more about it's more about political bias against the United States. They don't care. The same thing with the Europeans. I mean, the ECB went out and polled their European banks like, what happens if dollar swaps disappear to the
hold
banks?
on, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. We're going to get there. We're not there yet. I don't want to. I don't want to spoil that. So, okay. So my point is, all of these deals in dollars, all of this investment in dollars means that those countries have to receive dollars in order to meet the commitments they made to the U.S. in dollars.
Correct.
Therefore, they're not going to want to receive payment in CNY or any euros or any other currency necessarily. It really cements the centrality of the dollar in the Middle East, right?
Yeah, there was no real question that the dollar was facing any kind of stress. That's just a
Right.
made up thing.
Right. There never was. But I think this really cements it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Iran. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also about Qatar. So we talked about Qatar earlier in last week's discussion. And I want to talk about Iran and how the discussions with Iran are related to these commitments made. So Qatar put $1 trillion or committed $1 trillion or something to come to the U.S. and a big plane and all sorts of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they are effectively I can't remember if I said this earlier, but kind of Qatar is to Iran what Hong Kong had been to China, right? It's the open city where things can happen. And
Yep.
to a lesser extent, I think Sharjah and stuff could be. But so as Qatar gets close to the US, now keep in mind, Qatar has wanted to invest in the US at scale for years and years, but because of political flack, they haven't been able to.
Mm-hmm.
So that reconciliation has happened. And if you remember, a couple of years ago, some universities had to get rid of their campuses in Doha because of the political flack between the US and Qatar. Okay. So if it feels like some sort of Iran deal is happening. I don't exactly know the form of it, but it feels like something's happening. Do you get that same feeling, Albert?
Yes and no. To be honest with you, if you take the rhetoric out of the media, you could, think that you'd be justified thinking so. But from long time experience and whatnot, it just feels like they're just going to try to run the clock out, on Trump. They know that he's only there for the last 3 years, and these type of verification of Iran nuke stuff takes years and years and years to get into to get into the process of being able to go into the country, validate what they're saying, and so on.
Okay, so so that's a no from you.
Basically,
Okay,
just a
so
fancy no.
okay, so so it's okay. We disagree on that. And then let's also talk about Syria. So it was announced overnight that Syria's currency, which has been printed in Russia for decades, will now be printed in the UAE and in Europe. Okay. So that tells me that Syria is moving from Iranian control and Russian control to the Saudi, UAE, US axis of control. So, so effectively, Russia's influence in Syria is now pretty minimal because they don't control the money. And Syria has been Russia's base for Africa operations. So it's possible that by doing that, Russia's ability to get involved in African operations is also minimized. Am I overreading that?
No, I mean that's generally correct. With Russia taking a step back because of their failure in the Ukraine, inevitably they were going to fall behind, specifically in Syria and Africa, as you mentioned. I mean, honestly, it's like Africa is one of the key points that they tried to influence for the future, and they simply don't have the manpower, they don't have the money, they don't have the military to do that. Syria was their launch pad to provide such support, and that's basically gone.
Yeah.
Um, the Russians, when they were printing the money, it worked out because Assad was, politically aligned. But this new, I don't even know what it is, a government. I don't want to call it a government yet in Syria, but this
Turkish supported, what is it?
collective,
Organization.
I don't know. They're trying to make amends with the West because they know that they need the West financially. You see it. Again, it's going to be a while till that shakes out. Who's the real leader going to be in 3 to 5 years?
Right. Exactly. These things you rarely have the same leader over the long term as you did when the change happened.
Yeah,
So we have Russian influence in Syria is dissipating. And with that Russian influence in Africa, we've also seen Chinese influence in Africa begin to dissipate over the past couple of years. So it's interesting to me to see both Russian and Chinese influence in Africa dissipate. And what that will do for the continent, I think, is probably a good thing. We can spend more time on Africa at a different time, but I think China had tried for years to have influence in the Middle East, and that's obviously failed. And it's clear to see that after the Trump trip. So, who is not, which countries in the Middle East are not leaning US aligned after this trip, aside from Iran?
it's hard to say. Hard. It's hard to say that. I don't. I couldn't say anything but Iran at the moment. Even the Turks, with Hakan Fidan, has shifted more towards the West. Everyone knows that Hakan Fidan is a pro-Western guy. He's probably going to take over for Erdogan. That would be the only one that I would say, well, Turkey's been, wish-washing back and forth, but everybody else is pretty much falling into line. They see the writing on the walls. The Chinese are nothing to talk about. The Russians are, dwindling in influence in the region. Who else you got? There's only one other big dog in the yard, and that's the U.S. I mean, Europe they've got financial problems up the wazoo, so they're not really I mean, they try to be, but they're not really a influencer there.
Yeah, the other thing you said, Albert, that Ukraine, I think you said Ukraine was a distraction for Russia. We can't kind of underscore that enough, because if Russia hadn't taken their eye off the ball to focus on Ukraine, their influence in the Middle East would still be very heavy, and their influence in Africa would still be very heavy. But I think we've really seen them get distracted, and Ukraine has really taken down a lot of their geopolitical influence. Now, the other player that isn't talked about much is India. India has very good relationships with Iran and Qatar and other places. So the US and India warming up over the past few months, I believe, has also helped to facilitate those Iran discussions. So I could be wrong, but I suspect that India is very much an unsung player behind the scenes in getting Iran at least to the table, if not encouraging them to talk.
Yeah, I mean the Iranians are big clients of. I mean the Indians are big clients of Iranian crude, whether it goes through Iraq or on whatever ship is flying whatever flag that day. But
Yeah,
the reality is,
UAE,
yeah, the
Fujairah.
Indians the Indians are big clients of the Iranian crude, so they do have a say.
Yep. So, okay, so overall, successful trip. I think I'm sure there are downsides and cynics and people who want to see bad stuff, and I'm sure there's bad stuff, but generally seems to me to be a really successful trip and really cements some of the foreign policy that the new administration has been trying to do. Let's move on to domestic issues in the US. Now, if you're in the US and you pay attention to news, you've heard about this thing called the Big Beautiful Bill, which is a budget bill going through the House and being reconciled with the Senate right now. So, Albert, can you tell us generally about the Big Beautiful Bill?
Well, it's Trump's idea of passing budgets and fiscal. I want to say conservatism, but that's a joke when you see the size of this bill. The issue I have that Trump is he's losing support in mainland America right now, and it's filtering through into the GOP. I mean, the Senate has pretty much said you're not going to get a rubber stamp from us here on in. Congressional members in the House are a little bit antsy because these Doge cuts took away a lot of free programs that a lot of America, and especially in the rural areas, used. And we were talking beforehand, there's been Americans that I know that I would never have thought the words that I think I would prefer Hillary over Trump would come out of their mouths, right? So it's problematic for Trump with legislation. This big beautiful bill, I don't think is going to have a clear path to getting passed. I mean, what congressman really wants to pass a budget and start cutting out things that they promised their constituents, especially in a lead up to a midterm? It's just
Sure.
I don't think it's I don't think this bill is going to go far before
Okay.
there's a
So
big problem.
let's check out a couple things. First of all, this is an actual budget that is going through Capitol Hill, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the US government has operated on continuing resolutions for how long? Decade and a half, something like that.
Close, yeah.
We haven't had a legitimate budget passed for a long time. So this is the first legitimate budget that is going through Capitol Hill for a long time. And I think at least from the perspective of institutional credibility and institutional responsibility, this is sending a message that, look, Capitol Hill has to pass a budget. We can't just operate on continuing resolutions. So that's what I see from my,
Yeah, that's
high
that's
school
fair.
civics class or whatever.
Yeah, that's fair, Tony, right? But however, Trump and the GOP ran on, debt is going out of control and blah blah blah, and all of a sudden you're looking at a $4 to $5 trillion increase in the deficit. It's like, what are you doing? Like, you're literally going back on what you said you were going to do.
So let's talk about that. So because you were saying earlier that people are upset that the programs that they want have been cut out, but you're also saying that it's adding, say, $4 trillion of additional debt to the US. So how can both things happen?
It's hard to have both things happen. That's the beauty of politics. You have to sit there and try to figure out which programs satisfy the most of your constituents right now. But again, most voters, they don't really care about campaign rhetoric as long as things are getting done in a proper manner. But you're cutting off free programs and then on top of that, raising the deficit. That doesn't jive with what Trump ran on, right? And here we go again. with Janet Yellen 2.0, where Mag 7 is 35% of the goddamn market again, right?
Mm.
They're reinflating the bubble that they said that they were going to deflate. So like what are we doing here under the Trump administration? Like you talk about debts and deficits and getting rid of the elite and like the tech bros and whatnot, and you've done exactly opposite.
But
In
the
this,
tech bros paid for his inauguration party.
well, of course, I mean that's what tech bros do. They wear vests and
Right.
pay for parties. You know.
Right. Exactly. Well, okay, we'll see what happens there. I think it's probably going to be 3 to 4 weeks before we have clarity on what's actually happening with that. I think he said he wants it passed by July or something.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, but we'll see. I mean, there's going to be a lot of drama, and
Yeah.
so I don't know yet. I don't know Capitol Hill like Capitol Hill. So I'm just taking in different headlines, and to be honest, I can't tell what's partisan and what's not
Well,
partisan.
I'll tell you what. The Freedom Caucus is not going to vote for a bill that raises the deficit. That's that high. It's just a no go.
Yep. And just for viewers, who are some of the members of the Freedom Caucus?
I don't know. They I don't even know who they are exactly.
But they're
You
typically
know,
fiscal conservatives, right?
yeah, they're fiscal conservatives, usually from Oklahoma, Texas, and the South and whatnot. And they don't really like this deficit, right? They're on the borderline of libertarian almost, but
Ooh,
they are anti deficits and debts. And this bill is just not gonna. The amount of this bill is just a no go for them.
yeah. I wince when you say libertarians because if you're not an academic or a millionaire, or a billionaire, I don't understand why anybody would be a libertarian.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, okay. So let's move on to ECB on dollar swaps. This was something that Albert was very opinionated on social media about this week. So tell
It's
me,
not just this week, Tony. It's not just this week. I like
so you've talked about ECB and dollar swaps for years, but something came up this week. So tell us
yeah.
on
So,
that.
for years I've been saying, if the U.S. wants to get tough, if Trump wants to get tough, cut off those swap lines.
Yep.
If they want to talk tough against the U.S. and BRICS currency and gold standard junk, okay, cut the dollar swaps.
Yep.
Apparently, it's gained some traction, especially in D.C. and in Brussels, where they pulled some of the banks, the EU banks said, hey, what would happen if you got cut off from dollars?
Destruction.
Obliteration. I mean,
Yep.
the euro would. So what would happen would be that they'd have non-performing loans cascading back onto them, right? Because what happens is when the ECB gets dollars, they multiply that out by 4 or 5 to their banks, the EU banks,
Fractional banking.
and then
That's right.
and then the EU banks multiply that out by 10. Right. So for every $1 you have, you probably have about 20 in debt.
But I thought Germans were fiscally conservative and they led the EU fiscal approach.
Yeah, sure. It's just lies based on Ponzi dollar schemes that they've got going on over there. But if the EU banks were cut off from dollars, all those loans that would come back would be unable to be serviced, right? So the EU banks would have to call up the ECB and say, hey, we don't have enough money to cover this stuff. Like, you have to backfill us. And the ECB would be, well, if there's no dollars coming in, the ECB would be forced to print euros. And if they printed enough euros to cover all those debts, hyperinflation would take place.
Right. That's a death spiral, because if you print more euros, you have a devalued euro. If you have a devalued euro, you can never earn enough dollars. And then you have Germany 27 or something like that.
Yeah, the last time the EU banking sector was in stress was 2012, and Germany, and I'm sure probably another 1 or 2 countries, were secretly printing their own currency in case the euro broke apart. That's
really?
How. Oh,
they
yeah.
were secretly printing their legacy currency.
The Germans. I had found this out because I found out by a couple of port officials telling me that they were buying currency paper, transferring currency paper. And then like a week later, Harold Malmgren told me the same thing through a different source. So
is it still where Crane is the only one who prints currency paper?
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's just Crane. I think maybe one or two other companies does also on a smaller basis, but they had gotten currency paper and they were printing Deutschmarks in case they had to, step in for the euro collapse.
That is weird, wild stuff.
Well, I mean, the
Right.
euros it's on borrowed time in the political makeup of what the EU is at the moment. So again, you talking about cutting off dollars, it would be a very, very swift ride to Zimbabwe for the EU. They
Yeah.
would be Zimbabwe 2.0.
And no doubt they would blame the Greeks and the Italians, right?
They
Even
blame,
though,
sure, they can blame whoever they want to blame, but
yeah,
you cut off dollars, you're nuking yourself.
right. Exactly. Exactly. So,
And I'm not saying this because I'm American, blah, blah, blah. It's just the way the euro dollar works. You have
yep,
to understand that this is the reserve currency. It is the only reserve currency. There's nobody else. You
right.
can't cut yourself off by buying gold, right? And say, oh, yeah, now we're a gold asset. That doesn't work either,
Yes.
right? Because countries like Albania can spray paint lead and like, we're a gold asset too.
Right. Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
but think about it, Tony. Like if they decide to
China
go
did
on
it.
the yeah, well, China's like 15% of their gold reserves are fake,
Yep.
and
Yep.
like because no country is going to allow any objective third party to come in there and audit those things, right?
Can
Audit
you
gold.
imagine all these guys, and we know some of these guys, who are saying CNY is going to be the global currency, just overlooking the fact that 15% of China's gold reserves are fake. 15%. Like, how can you overlook that and go, that's okay, we'll take on CNY anyway?
But yeah, exactly. And it's not even that. Like if they were, talking about like a gold standard, or getting away from the dollar and this kind of event and going to like gold assets and whatnot. It's like what is preventing a small country like Albania or Malta to spray paint lead and say, "Hey, here's gold. Now we're going to issue currency against this." Oh, you can't audit it because we're not going to let you. Just like you guys don't let us audit it because no
Yeah, they might as
country.
well hold crypto.
Again, yeah, there's another one, but it's just comical to me. Like everybody's trying to like demonize the dollar, rightfully or wrongfully, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's the only reserve currency. It's not changing in any of your lifetimes.
Yes.
So don't worry. Like
Yeah.
don't fall for these things.
Yeah. The dollar is the prettiest of a bunch of ugly sisters.
As
That's
soon
the
as
way to
I
look at it.
saw, as soon as I saw that there was another system coming up, to challenge the dollar, I would be the first to say, "Here's a warning sign. This is
Of
what's
course.
happening. Figure it out."
Yep. Yep. Okay. But what do we know? We're just two bloviating old men.
Yeah, that's right.
So, so all right, Albert, thank you for your time. Thank you so
Yep.
much. For everyone watching, please like this. Please subscribe to this channel. Please subscribe to Cloak and Dagger in the link below. And we'll see you next week. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Tony.